She thought her days of love were over, until the cowboy who never stopped waiting rode back into her life. As the storm raged outside, she let her hair fall loose, and with it, the walls around her heart. The house stood alone on the rise, a weary shape of weathered boards and peeling whitewash, its timbers groaning against the winter wind. Beyond it, the plains stretched without end, frozen fields, stripped trees, a horizon the color of ash. The world was vast, and Clara Whitmore was small within it, a figure bent to her chores, shawl drawn close, hair wound into a braid that never unraveled, not even in sleep. Her hands bore the record of years, calloused and cracked, darkened by sun and stove smoke. She swept the porch though no one came to call. She split kindling though the woodpile already leaned high against the shed. Every task was done more from habit than need, the rhythm of labor anchoring her against the silence that pressed on all sides. The rocking chair sat by the door, its curved runners creaking whenever the wind reached through, as though some invisible hand had claimed the seat. Clara had not rocked there in years. Once, her husband had sat in it, boots planted wide, carving small shapes from wood, horses, stars, initials. He had gone to the ground young, fever taking him before gray could touch his hair. Since then, the chair remained, a sentinel of memory. Inside, the house bore the hush of abandonment, though Clara lived within it. The parlor smelled of dust and the faint lingering of kerosene. A shawl hung always on its peg, worn at the edges where her fingers had clutched it through countless winters. In the kitchen, the coffee pot cooled on the stove, the bitter scent of it sharp as iron. She poured a cup each morning, not out of hunger but because the sound of the pour, the steam rising, gave the illusion that she was not entirely alone. In the cedar chest at the foot of her bed lay a wedding dress wrapped in muslin, its lace yellowed by years. She had not unfolded it since the burial, though sometimes she traced the outline through the cloth, her hand hovering as if touching the fabric might summon back the woman she once was. Alongside it lay her husband's rifle, oiled but unused. The sight of it filled her not with security, but with the recognition that certain tools, like certain loves, outlived their purpose. Each morning, Clara faced her reflection only as necessity demanded. The mirror above the washstand showed her a woman lined at the corners of her eyes, hair threaded with silver though still thick, mouth pressed into a line that seemed half born of grief and half born of stubborn endurance. She did not linger there. She tied her hair into its braid with practiced swiftness, as though to bind away any vanity that dared to rise. It was ritual, not adornment. She no longer attended town gatherings. Dances had ceased for her after the first year of widowhood. Neighbors had invited her, gently at first, then less often when she declined. She avoided the fiddle tunes, the laughter, the warmth of company, things that reminded her of what had once been hers and could not be again. The notion of romance had withered long ago, replaced by the steady companionship of work, the bleak comfort of predictability. Outside, the prairie wind scoured across the land. It carried the smell of snow even before flakes appeared, a metallic chill that slipped through the smallest cracks. The fields, bare stubble now, whispered of another harvest done, another year turning. Time in such a place was not counted by clocks, but by the cycle of soil and sky, by the way seasons carved themselves into bone. Clara felt each year more keenly than the last. She told herself she no longer wished. Wishes belonged to the young, the girls with ribbons in their hair, the brides who walked to church on their father's arm, the wives whose rocking chairs still held a partner beside them. For a woman past her 40s, with hands roughened and hearts scarred, wishes were dangerous. Better to silence them, better to believe herself past such things. And yet, though she would never have spoken it, there were moments when the silence itself betrayed her. Nights when the fire burned low and the house creaked, when she lay awake listening to the wind pressing its palm against the shutters. In those hours, she felt the ache of absence, not only of her husband, but of touch, of voice, of the small exchanges that made days human, rather than merely endured. She rose before dawn each morning, the sky still heavy with stars, her lantern swinging across the yard. The earth was iron hard, the barn groaning as if it too felt weary. Horses stamped within, breath clouding the air. She moved among them with quiet efficiency, her shawl trailing behind her, her boots leaving prints that would soon be swept away by snow. These were her companions, the animals, the tools, the wind. They asked nothing of her but labor, and she gave it without complaint. Still, there were symbols everywhere of the life that had slipped behind her. The braid in her hair, tied the same as she had done when she was a girl. The wedding dress folded away, as if guarding a memory too fragile to unfold. The rifle, resting unused, a relic of protection once promised. Even the rocking chair, its empty motion a constant reminder that time moved on whether or not one was ready. That evening, as twilight deepened, Clara sat by the stove with her shawl drawn tight. The coffee in her cup had gone cold, its bitterness fitting her mood. Outside, the prairie wind rose again, howling against the eaves, rattling the dry leaves that clung stubbornly to the yard's lone tree. The world seemed to speak in sighs and moans, a chorus of endings. She closed her eyes and told herself the same words she always did. That love and warmth belonged to the young, and that her path was one of quiet endurance. She would tend her land, care for her stock, keep her home, and ask nothing more. To want was to wound oneself afresh. The rocking chair creaked once more, moved by the hand of the wind alone. Clara did not look toward it. She sipped her cold coffee, set the cup aside, and folded her hands in her lap. The winter was coming, and she would meet it as she had met all else, in silence, with her shawl wrapped close and her heart held tighter still. The day had been long, the kind that left Clara's shoulders aching and her palms raw. She had mended a broken fence, hauled water, and carried wood until the shadows grew long and the air turned sharp with evening. By the time she wiped her brow with the corner of her shawl, the horizon had begun to burn, gold bleeding into crimson, crimson into violet. She stood by the porch, gazing across the sweep of prairie. The stillness was broken only by the caw of a crow and the whisper of grass in the wind. Then she heard it, the steady rhythm of hooves. At first she thought it a trick of distance, the way wind sometimes carried echoes from far trails. But the sound grew louder, measured, unhurried, yet drawing near. Her stomach tightened. Travelers were not always welcome visitors. Men who came alone at dusk often carried hunger in their eyes, or whiskey, or worse. She stepped back into the doorway, her hand brushing the memory of the rifle that rested inside, though she had not raised it in years. The rider came into view at the crest of the rise, horse dark against the dying light. He rode straight-backed but slow, as though time itself had taught him caution. As he drew closer, the lines of his face emerged, and Clara's heart gave an unsteady leap she had not known it could still make. It was Elias McGraw. She knew him at once, though decades had hardened him. His hair, once black, now bore streaks of iron. A scar ran like a pale river from the corner of his temple to his jaw. His eyes, however, had not changed. They were the same steady gray she remembered from youth, when he had stood beneath the cottonwood at the edge of a dance and asked her to share the floor. Eyes that had once looked at her as though she were the only thing alive in a room of 100. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "Elias," she whispered, the name almost lost in the wind. He dismounted with the slow ease of a man long practiced, boots hitting the earth with a solid thud. He held the reins loosely, tipping his hat in quiet greeting. "Evenin', Clara." His voice was deeper now, gravel worn smooth, shaped by distance and dust. It was not the voice of a boy, but of a man who had spoken to rivers, storms, and silence. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. "It's been years, too many," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only fact. For a moment, they stood as strangers who remembered being something more. The wind lifted the hem of her shawl. The horse stamped and snorted. Then, as if realizing the weight of the pause, Clara stepped back from the doorway. "You'd best come in then. Supper's plain, but it'll fill." He followed her inside with the same quietness that had always marked him, never pushing, never presuming. She set out what she had: cornbread left from the morning, beans warmed again, coffee reheated though it had grown bitter. They ate at the table with only the scrape of forks and the ticking of the clock between them. Elias spoke of little things: the trail south, the price of cattle, the storm he had ridden through 2 weeks past. His words were spare, as though each carried weight. Clara answered politely, her own voice measured. Beneath it all, however, ran an undercurrent she could not silence. To see him here, in her kitchen, after all these years, it stirred something. Long buried, a trembling in her chest she had thought herself too old to feel. And yet, she recoiled from it. She reminded herself she was no girl in ribbons, no bride-to-be. She was a woman hardened by loss, a woman whose hair silvered more each year, whose hands bore the marks of toil. She could not imagine what place she might still hold in a man's heart, least of all in his. Elias did not press. His gaze was steady, respectful, never lingering where it should not. When the meal was done, he set his fork down with care and said only, "Your cornbread's as fine as I remember." She allowed herself the smallest smile, though it vanished quickly. "You must have tasted finer on the trail." "No," he answered simply, and the word carried a weight she dared not meet. The silence that followed was not empty but full, like a room where something waits to be spoken, but remains folded away. Finally, Elias broke it with the gentlest of requests. "Would you mind if I let my horse rest in your barn tonight? I'll be on my way come morning." It was such a modest thing, and yet her chest tightened. He asked as though he had no right to more, though once he had offered her everything. Clara nodded. "The barn's yours. There's hay enough." He inclined his head in thanks, then rose, his boots echoing softly on the worn floorboards. He moved with the grace of someone accustomed to leaving places behind. Yet there was a slowness too, as if he wished to linger. From the doorway, she watched him lead his horse across the yard, the last light of sunset catching on the scar at his temple. He moved into the barn, and soon the sounds of settling, snorts, hooves, the rustle of straw, rose in the night air. Clara remained on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes drawn to the horizon where the sun had died into embers. She told herself it was only chance, only a weary rider seeking shelter. But deep within, another truth stirred, one she could not yet name, that the past was not gone. It had found its way back, riding through dusk, and stood now in her yard. She turned at last, stepping inside. The rocking chair swayed once more, as the wind pressed against the house, but this time the sound seemed less lonely, more like the murmur of something returning. She closed the door, heart unsteady, unsure whether to welcome or to fear what tomorrow might bring. The storm announced itself in a low growl along the horizon, a rumble that rolled across the prairie before the rain arrived. By nightfall, the sky split open. Sheets of water lashed against the shutters, and the wind howled through every crack as if old spirits had come searching for a way inside. The house shuddered against the onslaught, timbers groaning, roof rattling beneath the hammering rain. Clara drew the bolt across the door and set another log onto the fire. Sparks leapt upward, painting the rafters with orange glow. The hearth became their only warmth, a pocket of light in a world reduced to storm. Elias sat near it, his hat resting on the floor beside him, steam rising from his damp coat. His face, shadowed by the flames, looked older than it had in daylight, the scar across his jaw like a pale thread pulled too tight. Neither spoke at first. They listened instead. The hiss of rain, the groan of trees bending under wind, the endless rush of water across the land. But silence in such company is seldom empty. At length, Elias spoke, his voice low and steady. "Storm like this reminds me of a summer down by the river. You recall it? Must have been near 25 years ago now." Clara felt her chest tighten. She remembered. The barn dance had ended, the music still ringing in her ears, and she and Elias had walked down to the river's edge. She had worn a blue shawl, the fringe damp with dew, and he had skipped stones across the water while she laughed at his poor aim. The river had glimmered in moonlight, alive with reflected stars. She had been young enough then to believe life might stretch forever, I recall, she admitted, her voice barely louder than the fire's crackle. He smiled faintly, though his eyes remained on the flames. "I carved your name in a fence post the night after. Fool thing for a cowboy to do. That post rotted years ago, I reckon, but the letters stayed in me." The words settled between them like embers. Clara lowered her gaze to her lap, hands folded, tightly. A guilt she could not name stirred within her, for even allowing such memories space to breathe. She had been a wife, a widow. To think of Elias with warmth felt disloyal to a man long buried, and yet the ghosts of those days flickered before her now, summoned by firelight and storm. She sought distraction. "Tell me of your life since then." He shrugged, leaning back in the chair, the fire's glow etching hollows in his cheeks. "Cattle drives, mostly. Kansas trails, up through Nebraska. Work steady, though it takes a man where he never planned to go. Slept under stars more nights than I've slept in beds. Got a scar outside Dodge once, knife fight in a saloon. Foolishness, but I lived." His hand brushed unconsciously at the line along his temple. Clara studied him quietly, seeing not only the man before her but the years that had marked him. Dust, distance, solitude. Elias fell silent, then spoke again, softer this time. "Truth is, I don't recall much of the men I worked beside, nor the towns I passed, but I remember the shawl you wore that summer, blue, with fringe. I remember the way you always tied your braid the same, even when every other girl was pinning her hair up to look grown. I remember you had a quiet strength about you, stronger than most men I've known. Those are the things I carried." Clara's throat closed. She could not summon an answer. She turned instead to the hearth, staring so intently at the flames her eyes stung with more than heat. When the wood burned low, she rose to fetch another log from the pile in the back room. The lantern flickered in her hand as she stepped through the darkened hall. Her path led her past the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She paused there, the storm hammering against the roof above, her lantern throwing its glow across the worn wood. For the first time in years, she knelt and laid her hand upon the lid. The grain was smooth beneath her fingers, polished by time and touch. Slowly she lifted it just enough to glimpse what lay inside. The muslin-wrapped bundle, the wedding dress folded within. She did not open it, only rested her palm against the cloth. The lace and satin had yellowed, but the memory was still white and bright in her mind. The day she had worn it, the vows spoken, the life begun and ended too swiftly. Her breath trembled. She realized she had locked herself inside grief as surely as one locks away a rifle. Not used, not lifted, but never far from reach. Grief had been her shield and her prison both. Closing the chest with care, she took up the firewood and returned to the hearth. Elias looked up as she entered, his gaze lingering on her as though he could read the storm not only outside, but within her. She did not speak of the chest, nor the dress, nor the ache that had risen sharp and sudden. She set the log onto the fire and sat once more, her shawl drawn close. The storm raged through the night, but inside the small house, two figures sat with ghosts flickering between them. Ghosts of dances and rivers, of names carved in wood, of lives once intertwined and torn apart by time. Clara told herself she was only keeping company through a storm, nothing more. Yet in the quiet of her heart she knew, love, once thought buried, still glimmered faintly, like embers beneath ash. And she feared as much as she longed to fan that flame. The morning after the storm, the world lay rinsed clean, the prairie shining beneath a pale sun. Puddles pooled in wagon ruts, and the air smelled of wet earth and cedar smoke. Clara hung damp shawls on the porch rail, her fingers stiff with cold, while Elias tended to his horse in the barnyard. For a brief span, the silence between them felt companionable, almost easy. By mid-morning, a rider appeared on the trail, dust-streaked, his coat flapping in the wind. He pulled up by the fence, doffing his hat in greeting. "Rustlers about," he called, voice sharp with warning. "Been cutting herds from ranches west of here. Best keep watch." Clara's stomach clenched. Trouble had always ridden these plains, but seldom so close to her door. She thanked the man, who spurred his horse on without pause. When she turned, Elias was watching her, his gray eyes steady. "You ought to ride on," she said, words pressed from her chest. "If they're near, no good'll come of you stayin'." Elias shook his head slowly. "I've faced men like that before. I'll not leave you to face them alone." Her breath caught, though she disguised it as a sigh. She turned back to her laundry line, but the knowledge of coming danger pressed down like heavy weather. That night, the wind carried an edge. The moon rose thin and pale, clouds drifting across its face like torn cloth. Inside, Clara trimmed the lantern wick while Elias checked the latch on the barn. The house felt smaller than usual, the silence between them taut with expectation. Then came the crunch of boots on frozen earth. Two figures emerged from the darkness, rifles slung low, hats pulled deep. Their movements were lazy, confident, the swagger of men who believed they owned the night. One rapped his knuckles against the porch post, grinning beneath the brim of his hat. "Evenin', ma'am," he drawled, eyes sliding over Clara as she stood in the doorway. "Heard tell you got stock here. Figure maybe we take a look." Before she could answer, Elias stepped forward, placing himself squarely between her and the intruders. His hand rested light but deliberate on the butt of his revolver. He did not draw, but the promise of it hung heavy. "No stock here worth your trouble," Elias said evenly. "Best you ride on." The taller of the two men spat into the dirt. "Don't take kindly to being told where to ride." His hand twitched toward his rifle. Tension thickened, sharp as lightning waiting to strike. Clara's heart hammered. She reached back into the shadowed hallway, her fingers finding the cold steel of her husband's old rifle. For years it had lain in the cedar chest, oiled but unused. Now it was in her hands, heavier than she remembered, her arms trembling beneath its weight. She stepped onto the porch beside Elias, the barrel angled skyward but clear in sight. The men's eyes flicked to her, then back to Elias. The grins faded, replaced by calculation. The standoff stretched, wind sighing through the grass, lantern light flickering across tense faces. At last, the shorter man muttered something under his breath. With a shove of his shoulder, he turned away. "Come on," he spat. "Ain't worth the trouble tonight." They retreated into the dark, boots scuffing, muttering threats that dissolved into the night air. Hoofbeats soon faded down the trail, swallowed by distance. Only then did Clara lower the rifle, her shawl trembling against her shoulders. Her knees felt weak, yet she did not collapse. Instead, she leaned the weapon against the porch rail, her breath visible in the cold night air. Elias holstered his revolver with calm precision, then turned to her. His gaze was unreadable, though his jaw was set hard. "You did well," he said quietly. Clara shook her head, but the words settled in, her like a coal sparking to life. She had not thought herself capable of facing danger again, yet here she stood, blood thrumming, heart alive. Inside, the lantern burned low, casting long shadows against the walls. Clara busied herself with the coffee pot, her hands steady despite the storm still racing through her veins. Elias sat at the table, his hat on the chair beside him, his eyes following her movements as though weighing unspoken words. When the coffee was poured, strong and bitter, he finally spoke. "You should know, Clara. I've carried you with me. All these years, like a compass when the trail went dark." Her hand froze on the pot's handle. Heat flushed her face, though the night was cold. She did not lift her gaze, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. Instead, she placed the pot down carefully and slid his cup toward him. "Drink," she murmured, her voice quieter than she intended. He obeyed, wrapping his hands around the cup as though it were a hearth fire, in his palms. Silence filled the room again, but it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of words too deep to speak, words that lingered in the air like the aftertaste of strong coffee. Clara sat opposite him, her own hands folded tightly in her lap. She could still feel the echo of the rifle against her shoulder, the weight of it both terrifying and empowering. For the first time in years, she did not feel fragile. She felt alive. Winter descended in earnest, a heavy hand pressing white silence upon the plains. Snow fell for days without cease, cloaking the homestead in stillness. Fences vanished beneath drifts, and the world beyond Clara's yard seemed to dissolve into a white emptiness where sky and earth became one. The only sound was the wind's mournful whistle through the eaves and the creak of trees burdened with ice. Clara rose earlier now. lantern light guiding her through the dark mornings. Paths had to be shoveled, wood carried in, animals fed and watered before the troughs froze solid. Elias worked beside her without needing to be asked. He cleared snow from the barn roof, chopped kindling until the pile was stacked high, mended, tools with the patience of a craftsman who knew nothing was too small to save. She watched him sometimes from the corner of her eye. The careful way he set a nail, the ease with which he soothed a restless horse, the rare smile that surfaced when a task went well. Nights grew long, the fire their only companion. They ate simply, beans and bread, potatoes roasted in the coals. Afterward, they sat together in quiet, the rocking chair now steady with his weight, while she sewed or read aloud from the one book she still kept. His laughter came rarely, but when it did, low and genuine, it filled the room with a warmth deeper than the fire. The days passed not quickly, but with a rhythm that settled into her bones. The house no longer seemed as hollow. Even silence had changed its shape. It no longer pressed against her, but lay between them like a quilt shared in winter. One evening, after the lamps were trimmed and Elias had gone to the barn, Clara lingered before the mirror in her room. She drew her braid forward across her shoulder. It was long still, heavy with silver threads but strong, a braid she had tied the same way every morning for decades. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled loose the pins and began to unravel it, strand by strand. The hair fell around her shoulders in a dark, gleaming curtain streaked with age. It was a ritual she had never let another see, not her husband, not a soul. To undo the braid felt like unbinding years of silence, years of restraint wound tight. She heard footsteps in the hall. Elias, returning from the barn, paused at the open door. For an instant, Clara's first instinct was to hide, to gather the strands back into order. But her hands stilled. She let the braid fall loose, her reflection unguarded in the mirror. Elias did not step forward. He only leaned against the doorframe, his presence filling the space like low thunder. His voice, when it came, was soft and steady. "I never married." Clara's fingers froze on the brush. She met his gaze in the mirror. His eyes were calm, but behind them lay something that had endured decades, patient, unwavering. "Never found another," he continued. "Truth is, I never looked. Time don't dim some things. It only makes them clearer." Her throat tightened. She lowered the brush slowly, setting it on the table. Tears stung her eyes, though none fell. She had imagined many reasons for his long absence, another woman, another life, the slow erasure of memory. But not this. Never this. For a moment, she could not speak. Words scattered like dry leaves in her mind, useless. So instead, she turned from the mirror, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. She lifted it in both hands and laid it gently across the chair where he would soon sit, the gesture as plain and as powerful as anything she might have spoken. Elias's gaze lingered on the shawl, then on her. He inclined his head, a quiet acknowledgement, and stepped inside. He did not move closer, did not reach for her. He simply took the chair, settling into it as though it had always waited for him. Clara sank onto the edge of her bed, her hair unbound, the firelight from the other room casting a golden flicker across the walls. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full, like snow falling thick outside, soft and unending. For the first time in decades, Clara felt not the ache of absence, but the presence of something returning. Something she had thought gone forever. She did not name it, not yet. But she knew. Love had not passed her by. It had been circling patiently, waiting for her courage, waiting for her to unbraid the silence she had bound around her heart. The snow did not leave all at once. It lingered in drifts against the fence posts, in shaded corners of the yard where the sun had not yet reached. But day by day, the weight of winter loosened. Icicles wept steady tears from the eaves, and rivulets carved paths through the yard, running like silver veins across the prairie. Clara stood at the window one morning and listened. The silence of snow had given way to the sound of water in motion, the first music of spring. It stirred something deep in her, a reminder that the land itself was capable of beginning again. The garden soil, once frozen hard, began to soften. Clara pressed seeds into the earth with careful hands, her shawl slipping from her shoulders as the sun grew warm on her back. Elias worked beside her, turning the soil with a steady rhythm. He said little, but his presence was enough. Together they bent to the earth, planting not only food for the months ahead, but something unseen, something rooted in the shared labor of renewal. The house, too, had changed. The rocking chair on the porch no longer swayed empty in the wind. Elias often claimed it in the evenings, whittling a piece of wood or sipping coffee while Clara stitched by the doorway. The house that once groaned with silence now carried the sound of 2 sets of footsteps, the murmur of conversation, the occasional rise of laughter that surprised even Clara with its ease. One afternoon, while Elias mended a harness in the barn, Clara opened the cedar chest. The scent of cedar rose sharp and sweet as she lifted the lid. Inside lay her wedding dress, folded with care so many years ago. She drew it out gently, the fabric yellowed but intact, delicate lace still clinging to the hem. She did not hold it against herself, did not lift it to her body. That belonged to another life, another love that had shaped her but no longer bound her. Instead, she spread it across the bed, smoothing the fabric with reverent hands. The dress was not a ghost to banish nor a chain to carry. It was a memory to honor. After a long while she folded it again, more carefully than before, and laid it back to rest in the chest. Some loves, she knew, were meant to be remembered. Others were meant to be lived. That evening, as the sun dropped low and the prairie glowed gold, Clara stepped outside. Elias was there, leaning against the porch rail, his hat tipped back, eyes on the horizon. She joined him without words. He reached for her hand, calloused from reins and ropes, worn from weather and work. She did not pull away. Instead, her fingers closed around his, the gesture simple yet profound. They stood together as the sky stretched wide above them, vast enough to hold both memory and the promise of days yet to come. The prairie wind moved gently through the grasses, carrying the scent of thawing earth and the first hint of wildflowers. For the first time in decades, Clara did not feel the ache of passing years. She did not measure her life in seasons lost, but in the richness of the present moment. The soil beneath her nails, the warmth of a hand in hers, the sky opening into endless blue. Love, she realized, was not bound to youth. It was not a season that vanished with time. It was a river, buried perhaps beneath snow and silence, but always flowing, always waiting for the thaw. And now, as spring returned to the land, so too had love returned to her, patient, enduring, alive.